Yeah, that's fair. I think final question we'll get to this evening, before I kind of point people to your work as well, is on, I guess, moral responsibility and free will. So the question goes, how does the presence or absence of free will influence our ideas of moral responsibility? Can individuals be held morally accountable if free will is an illusion? Now, I'm very much aware that we've been saying this entire time that free will and determinism can coexist, hence compatibilism. Um, I'm just aware that the sort of moral responsibility element often comes under fire when people begin to reduce free will from anywhere near the libertarian version of free will. So I guess if you can take it from that stance, Joe, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I will say too that there are independent threats to moral responsibility, not just threats from determinism. And so a lot of work on moral luck, I think, is really interesting, important, and you know, and there are people who think that the only chance of you know getting out of some of these moral luck arguments is a kind of libertarian free will, which kind of provides some kind of grounding. And also, it's weird because I think most people, when they kind of defend free will against free will skepticism, uh, are less sympathetic of free will skepticism than I am. And you know, I mean, I'm mostly confident that whether we have free will or not has nothing to do with determinism. I'm not as confident that we have free will, and especially when you think of and well, my confidence increases the more modest the kind of free will. So, even if it turns out that we have this kind of modest version of free will, whether we have a robust enough level of freedom to be morally responsible for our actions, I think that is remains in a question and not and sort of independent of determinism. And I also think that I think there's something wrong with our like what I would call our system of moral responsibility. But I think in part because it's sort of informed with uh, these kind of libertarian aspects. One way to see this is if, like on some models, say a virtue model, um, you know, there's an encouragement towards a kind of level of freedom that is probably not easily attainable by all people. So whether or not actually, um, models of virtue tell us like how to be, a perfectly moral person or how to be, good enough to get along. I think that's you know, a genuine kind of question. And again, I think that Neil Levy gives a lot of reasons for thinking that the sort of overall cognitive capacities that we have, or lack of cognitive capacities, don't put us in the best situation in terms of being the kinds of creatures that should be held uh, accountable for their actions. But you know, um, and I'd add to that. There's this a woman named Hannah Picard, and she's interesting because she's both a clinical psychologist and a philosopher. She has a degree in philosophy, but she distinguishes her view from like views of free will skepticism, um, because it's not like she thinks that people aren't blameworthy, but in a clinical environment, blame is very unhelpful. If you want somebody to change, you have to kind of, sort of work with their will in a way that blaming activity sometimes inhibits, uh, kind of can get in the way. So I think that there are, you know, and well, then one last thing I'll mention just about the psychology of human beings that is just so interesting that we very rarely dwell on is that, again, if you think of this difference between, what I call modest and robust free will, where modest free will is just the ability to follow your desires or not, whereas and robust free will is concerns, more powers of discernment, more issues of knowledge and decision making, especially for your own well being or the well being of others. Um, we don't really develop, modest free will. We don't really, fully develop the frontal lobe, which supposedly is connected to the very capacities needed for modest free will until we're like in our mid 20s, right? Um, and now we might have some kind of lower level. Sorry, I didn't mean mine. I meant the robust free will until we're in our mid 20s. We might have this more modest free will, this sort of ability to follow our desires, but somehow, we have to get from, this other stuff that we're not responsible for to, this stuff that we are responsible for, this level where we are responsible for. And again, that all that stuff from the consequence argument, all these ideas about this transference of lack of control or whatever. I mean, it's hard to imagine how human beings can ever become morally responsible for anything, given the way that we start out. But I think part of that too is that, well, a lot of us don't always make it, and it has a lot to do with how we start out. And so, uh, you know, I I guess I would say that I do think that there are reasons for thinking that, um, our level of moral responsibility is maybe not what we thought that it was, um, and I do think that we need to, alter, to change, especially the criminal justice system, but in general our attitudes about blame, especially, and alter them. And I think a lot of times it's not so much to me that they're not fitting, although I think there are a lot of times that they're not fitting. But I think that they're inappropriate. I think certain kinds of blaming behavior they're inappropriate because they're just not conducive to the kinds of change that you want. You know, I mean, if you look at people that are actually in prison, 80% of them came from poverty. 80% of them have drug problems or mental illness, some kind of mental illness. In a lot of cases, you're taking people who've had a horrendous life, and you're punishing them further and thinking that somehow that's going to make them better or want to be better. I just don't get it. And I think a lot of people that are in prison shouldn't be there. And also, I think that once they're there, I mean, I don't. I'm not sure we're doing the kinds of things that we should be doing unless we had an idea of never letting them out. But because we're not really socializing them. Um, so this is a long-winded way, and I'm throwing out a lot of issues about moral responsibility that interest me. But I really do think that these debates, they don't track these issues in a kind of one-to-one way all the time. But I do think that these, even though I disagree with a lot of these debates, these incompatibilists and these free will skeptical arguments about the, prospects for against free will, especially free will in a determined world, I think it's uncovering a lot of data from science, and from the humanities, a lot of data about ways of rethinking moral responsibility that are going to be helpful, and more constructive and just better. If we pay attention to the data, I think we can make changes, and we don't have to. This is part of my pragmatism: is that we don't have to reject determinism, or we don't have to make these bold metaphysical, philosophical moves. Um, you know, but we could pay attention to the data, and there'd be more reason to do that if we thought that human beings were part of the causal nexus that we were involved in. Um, you know, uh,
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.